Okay, so for part three of today's introductory lecture, I'm going to very briefly introduce the sociology of gender. And really, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because there's going to be people later in the course with much more expertise in this area than me that's going to go into this in more detail. Basically, this is just going to act as a quick refresher to the very basics of the sociology of gender. So firstly, it's very important to remember the definitions of the different categories, and not to kind of confuse them and not to kind of slide them together. So sex refers to biological and physiological categories, gender to social, cultural and psychological qualities that are projected upon human bodies, so the kind of social and cultural norms and expectations. Sexuality is not the same as sex and gender. Sexuality describes sex orientation, desire, identity and practices. Sexuality in particular continues to be, particularly regulated by a whole bunch of different legal and policing and medical mechanisms. So again, they're the kind of basic categories here. We'll be looking mostly at the notion of gender in the course though, particularly the kind of cultural expectations and norms that are projected upon, men and women, and particularly how that relates to forms of inequality. So more broadly in terms of the sociology of gender, it's kind of challenges everyday assumptions and taken for granted understandings of the norms of what it means to be male and female or whatever in society. There's a bunch of different theoretical perspectives that do this, more kind of functional perspectives that talk about different roles and divisions of labour, more critical perspectives that bring in the notions of patriarchy and the way that social reproduction of gender inequalities kind of happened continually over time, particularly through things like the regulation of the body, through labour market inequalities, educational inequalities, all these kind of ways that institutions reproduce patriarchal inequalities. So we challenge these everyday taken for granted views, talk about the way that gender is socially constructed, and gender norms and things like that can actually differ quite a lot between cultures and between places, and shows therefore how they're not kind of necessarily determined by sex. Sociology also recognises that gender does not intrinsically belong to male and female bodies. That kind of gender traits break that binary all the time. So again, these are kind of the basics that we want you to kind of take with you when we look at gender throughout the course. So why do we study gender? Firstly, to kind of think about the way that interactions, in our day-to-day lives, in our families, in our workplaces, in different institutions, how these are imbued with gender norms and how this results in different opportunities and life chances in those systems. So gender identity and the way that kind of gender inequalities are, reproduced and policed and maintained in institutions is a key thing that sociologists are interested in when it comes to studying these things. We're interested also in the way that gender shapes how we view others and how we view ourselves, the way that how we're all socialised into the world and into particular gendered structures, and how this therefore means it kind of influences our understanding of things, our orientations toward others, and the things we choose to do and the things we choose not to do. This is particularly the case when it kind of seems that, people tend to choose, to play netball or to play football and all this kind of stuff, but really these choices relate to, norms and socialisation processes and expectations. We also want to think about how gendered structures form the basis of power and resource allocation differently and unequally for different people. How these structures create gender roles, rules and expectations, what we call normative constructions and normative discourses. So what's interesting about this is that even as there's been a lot of emancipatory progress, that's come from, feminist politics over the past decades, there's still very obvious and very deep gendered inequalities throughout all the different institutions of society, whether that's in terms of political representation, who gets, powerful jobs or who gets access to good jobs, who takes up key roles in institutions, and these kind of things. These things have constantly reproduced unequal access, and despite the fact of kind of claims of increased equality. Same thing goes for things like rates of pay. Still like something like 80 women get 80% of what a male gets. Even women in full-time work still tend to be doing more of the domestic duties and child rearing and stuff like that at home. So this is particularly interesting in the realm of what's increasingly called post-feminism, where there's this kind of kickback against feminism, the idea that things have become more equal, we don't really need it anymore. And there's lots of really interesting research and conceptual stuff that kind of looks into this kind of seeming contradiction between both progress and, very real and persisting inequalities. So in terms of youth studies, gender has been a really key area of research. And, as you would imagine, shows a whole kind of myriad of inequalities and differences when it comes to, access to the good graduate positions and things like that in particular. In youth culture areas, from the very early subculture theories, it was very quickly critiqued to how they these critical theories themselves often put women in kind of, secondary or supporting roles, or even downplayed their participation at all. And this is particularly the case because a lot of the early youth culture research tended to focus on kind of spectacular stuff happening in public space, where really a lot of other youth culture, goes on in the bedroom, in the house, in the backyard. So that's kind of been seen as a kind of, even like from the very early stages of the Birmingham School, this was a key critique made by other members of the Birmingham School, such as Angela McRobbie. In Australia, there's a really strong gender sociology and gender cultural studies part of youth studies. I'm not sure all these people would consider themselves youth studies practitioners, but they all kind of do research with young people. So in this course, we have Julia Coffey, who does work on the body and affect and body image and how this relates to things like well-being and health. A colleague in Melbourne, Anita Harris, really foundational work on the figures of the future girl and the can-do girl. Sorry, in a book Future Girl, on the figures of the can-do girl and the at-risk girl. The at-risk I've kind of shown already. The can-do girl was kind of this figure of kind of high achievement that's often portrayed in representations of kind of positive aspects of young people. Akane Kanai's really interesting work on different figures that young women themselves draw upon to communicate their lives to each other. The best friend, the boyfriend, other girls and hot guys and creeps. I really suggest if you're interested in things like digital cultures that you check out Akane's work. It's really interesting. She's has really interesting to say about the way that the intersections between class, race and gender work online. So further people that are in this area, if you're interested in this area, you can check out the work as Andrea Whaling, Steve Roberts, Sina Raven, Amy Dobson, Carla Elliott and Bianca Falborn. They're just the ones I kind of thought of off the top of my head when I was putting the lecture together. There's lots of really interesting work out there. Okay, and lastly, in terms of gender and crime, as the textbook points out this week, that again, there's lots of really interesting research that kind of draws out differences and problems in thinking with and through gender and crime. A lot of criminology tends to position young men as being just kind of naturally more violent. And really the kind of more critical sociology and masculinity studies critique that point of view and show that how masculinity itself and different kinds of masculinity are important for thinking about, the different ways that different groups and different individuals are, more likely or not to participate in crime and deviant behaviour. So again, relating back to what I was talking about in part 2, when it comes to gender and crime, social and cultural understandings don't necessarily point to different groups as being more likely to do stuff because it's natural or innate or genetic or psychologically normal. We're more interested in the way that the intersections of things like class and race and masculinity play a role in terms of exposing young people to the possibility of being involved in these practices, and even in terms of the different crimes or different forms of deviance that are committed. Up until quite recently, women were largely ignored when it came to youth crime, but this has been, challenged recently. The kind of mainstream bias of criminology and youth research on crime. Again, emphasising different social, cultural structures and norms around who does what and when and why and how. Okay, so to conclude, I just wanted to point out that there's a specific youth studies research group we now call the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre that people in this course are part of. So if you're interested in looking at a wider range of youth studies research, please check out our profiles. It's myself and Julia Coffey that are involved in this course, but also David Ferrugia and Julia Cook are youth studies researchers. And we all kind of work together on projects, but we also have different interests and different specialities. So please have a look at that. And also, if you are interested in youth studies particularly, there's a course running at the moment. At the same time, it's online only, called Youth Culture and Risk that I run. So if you have some space in your subjects and you're interested in this, feel free to check that one out and see if you'd like to take that one on. And there's a list of various topics that we look at throughout that course. Okay, thanks. I'll leave it there.